Are you a doomsday prepper? I hear that terminology all the time. I see those commercials, but this is what that sounds like. Would you categorize yourself as that?
I would categorize myself as the remnant of the Great Generation. That's one of the things. I find it particularly annoying. Modern culture condemns preparedness now by mocking it and calling people doomsday preppers. Okay,
overly paranoid.
My mother and father.
But that's what they call themselves, though.
Well, I don't call myself that. I call myself an American. I call myself a person who has the character profile that this country was originally founded by the founders, people who believe in rugged individualism and self-sufficiency and are jealous of their freedom and don't believe in trusting the government to take care of all of our needs, which is where we have become now. Those who call me a doomsday prepper, I would say those who don't prepare are sheep, and the kind of mentality that the founders, this country wasn't designed for sheep. It was designed for eagles. It was designed for people who believed in freedom and believed in self-sufficiency and not taking handouts. My father's generation, the generation that lived through the Great Depression and survived World War II, they had never heard of EMP. All of those people, virtually all of them, would be doomsday preppers because they didn't believe in trusting the government to take care of them. They had seen government fail in war and peace. They'd seen it fail in the Great Depression. They'd seen it fail with the outbreak of World War II. They knew, my father and my Uncle Joe, for example, who fought in World War II, against the Nazis. My father was a sergeant. My Uncle Joe had been a private. They knew that World War II was not won by Franklin Roosevelt and General George Patton. World War II was won by tough guys like them, who went up against Nazi tanks that were better than ours, better armed and better led Germans, and defeated them. It was their guts and blood that won World War II. And so, they were not, willing to trust in government. They'd seen government fail in peace during the Great Depression and in war. And they're the ones that got us through World War II. And that attitude persisted afterwards. That's why in the 1950s so many Americans were digging bomb shelters. We laugh at that today and seem to mock it today, but they were really concerned that government would screw up again and would have a nuclear war. And they wanted to survive and make sure their family would survive. We lived on a quarter acre, and we had orchards, apple trees, a garden. My mother was constantly canning food. They had never heard of EMP, but they were concerned that there would be some disaster, maybe an atomic war.
Was that more common back then than today? Do you think that was more of a common
absolutely.
Etiquette?
It was a common value of all Americans, beginning with the founding of this country, because those virtues that we're talking about here, the self-sufficiency, the rugged individualism, the pride, it was a point of pride that you wanted to be able to take care of your own family and not depend on a neighbor, and certainly not depend on a church or a government to take care of you. You wanted to be able to take care of your neighbors yourself. And
I have a slight pushback, if I may.
Sure.
There's something you talk about is something that's great in theory, but that's great in practice. I'm with you 100% on rugged individualism, taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, being self-sufficient, limited government, 1,000% on the same page. However, I also am a personal finance expert. I also know that 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. I understand that people are, have budgets. I understand that inflation is at 8%. It's going all-time high. Gas is expensive. Cost of living is expensive. So if I'm like, all right, Dr. Pry, I'm with you. I'm ready to go get a farm in Virginia or a place in the Everglades or something. How do you take that theory and put it into practice if you're making 50 grand a year or you're making 100 grand a year, or even if you're a multimillionaire, what percentage of your budget should you be putting towards getting a bunker or something like that? Because it's great in theory, amazing. Of course, everyone should have a bunker, but who's actually doing it? And that's what I'm grappling with right now.
About 3% of the population is actually doing it right now. And that's a shame, because of what it reflects, this passing of what we would call the pioneer values. The values that we're talking about here are what made America great and free in the first place. And most Americans, up until my father's generation, the great generation, had those values and were prepared. And they weren't making $100,000 a year. My father was making less than $50,000 a year, but they were prepared for anything. And have you ever heard of a victory garden? I mean, that was very common during World War II, and people made them on their own. I remember my Uncle Joe, he owned a bar down in Utica, New York, and he had a tiny little backyard. I mean, it wasn't, it was the size of a living room.
What is a victory garden?
It's a cultivated.
Wikipedia says a war garden or food gardens for defense, where vegetables, fruit, and herb gardens are planted at private residences and public parks in the United States, UK, Canada. Interesting.
Yeah, in World War II, almost everybody had a victory garden, and they would grow their own food. Anybody.
That's in a time where people were living in the suburbs. You had all this land. Now, majority of Americans are in New York City, in LA, in Chicago, downtown Miami.
My Uncle Joe was
There's
living.
no places like this.
My Uncle Joe was living in the middle of Utica, New York. Okay, and as I was explaining to you, the backyard behind his bar was maybe the size of a living room.
Where's Utica, New York, though?
Utica, New York's in upstate New York.
Okay, so what happens if I lived in New York City?
Well, if you live in New York City, you do what you can. You might want to think about, do you have friends who live in the country?
But here's what I would say, if I can jump in here. Here's what I would
have
say.
Water.
What percentage of America do you think needs to own a life insurance policy?
I mean, anyone with kids or a business.
Okay, only 54% do. 46% don't, right?
Yeah.
Some of them can do it, some of them cannot do it, right? Okay. What percentage of rich people here live on the water? There's people that are waterfront property. A lot of these guys are your friends. Okay, they got houses in Miami, whatever, beachfront, intercoastal, whatever maybe. Okay, great. Those guys are probably not going to have a nuclear, bomb shelter with victory gardens in a backyard where they're living at. But when a hurricane happens, what do? What happens when a hurricane happens?
They've got, either they leave town.
Okay. What happens?
Or
I've never been part of a hurricane inside. The other day, the weather was pretty crazy. What happened? But when a hurricane happens, what do most people do in Florida?
They put up their shutters and they just buckle down.
Or some of them drive up, right?
They get out of Dodge.
Okay, they get out of Dodge. So this isn't for 100% of people. The way I'm processing this, it's not for 100% of people. And to be honest with you, let's just say you don't have a lot of money as a family. What I would do it in something like this to prepare for it is I would have the family collectively decide to get one. Look, your religion, your faith is what? You grew up Judaism, right? I'm a Christian, right? I don't know what you grew up with yourself. I grew up around a lot of Mormons. I was in an insurance company, lots of guys that were Mormon. LDS, yeah. And one of the things that was very fascinating about the Church of Mormonism, okay, is they prepared their people a lot. I don't know how it is with Judaism, but
There's nobody more suspicious and paranoid than Jews.
Okay, so
just know that.
But how far do they take that? Because at Mormons that I went with, many of the people that were leaders, stake presidents, all this other stuff, they had in their homes, they were ready. That was one of the things that was very consistent.
Is this in Utah?
No, not in Utah. It was in Lodi, California. It was in, L.A. It was in
basements. What
they were fully prepared for it. That in case in Atlanta, and I'm talking like in Cummings, Georgia, and not like they were ready for something like that. And these are not people. These are people that are like, hey, if something happens, we're ready for it. This doesn't mean you go beat a place that's very exotic and all this other stuff. It's just something you build.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.